Welcome to Mediation Playbook, the podcast that provides winning negotiation strategies. Join us as we explore the world of holistic negotiation from experts across business and industry. Our guests will share with us their insights and draw on their experiences to provide you the techniques and tools you need to become a master negotiator. Now let's get started. Welcome to Mediation Playbook. I'm here with our guest today, John Marler, who is the Global Director of ESG for Ingram Micro. And John, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, how you got into your current role, and then we can talk a little bit about kind of the subject of today's session, which is how to have difficult conversations.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me, Dave, and excited for our conversation. I'm the director of Global ESG at Ingram Micro, one of the world's largest distributor of high technology products globally. Been in the position for about 2.5 years and working with them to basically build up their corporate ESG program, environmental, social, and governance, as well as environmental sustainability program, which we launched in 2022, a new program called Ingram Micro Planetary. So prior to that, I spent 8 years running energy management and environmental sustainability at the LA-based entertainment company AEG. Prior to that, you and I worked together at Southern California Edison, where I was in the renewable and alternative power group, working on the big contracts that Edison has between itself and its large energy suppliers. And then prior to that, was an attorney for 4 years at a litigation boutique in New York City, Ford Marin. And then my background I've always had some interest in environmental topics. So I was a geology major. I got my master's in hydrogeology. And then my first job out of my master's program was actually working for an organization monitoring the cleanup of a Superfund site outside of Denver, Colorado. So I got a lot of early education in very hot button, passionate issues, but also ways to, find common ground between parties, with different agendas. So looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's exactly why I wanted to have you on, because obviously you're dealing in a space where there's an intersection of interests, right? Kind of a confluence, if you will. You've got, as we talked about briefly before this, you've got the corporate interests. You talked about, for example, the what was the initiative, the Ingram Micro initiative, Planetary?
Yep, Ingram Micro Planetary. Yep.
Yeah. And kind of then you've got obviously the personal interests and then of the individuals you're working with. And then you've got their kind of siloed business interests of their particular group or section or part of the company. So I guess kind of start things off. Why don't you tell me about what are some of the dealing with ESG, obviously a topic that can be controversial. What are some of the myths that you've encountered while working through these various roles that you've held?
Yeah, I think the first one to address is kind of the idea that ESG is something that is or should be controversial. ESG stands for environmental social governance, and it's a set of questions and metrics that the investor community is looking for the companies that they invest in to report. Because I think the articulation, which I happen to agree with, is that if you're going to make a sizable financial investment in an organization, you want to have all the information that's going to influence your decision before you. And certainly the financial metrics are very important, but increasingly, I think the literature, the studies, and the market has shown that these other factors, such as, approach to managing their environmental impact, approach to how they treat people with outside the organization, and also how well the organization's governed and how well it adheres to various forms of governance are important. So that's one thing that we address right off the bat. Fortunately, I think that sort of ESG is controversial subject is more sort of in the mainstream political and sort of media area, doesn't really filter in too much to what we're doing in the day to day. But I think, one of the things I've dealt with in my career, sort of setting that ESG topic aside, is kind of I would say, what's the default, thought about environmental sustainability and sort of how it relates to company operations. A lot of times folks who don't have a lot of exposure to it think, right off the bat, oh, this is going to just cost us more money. It's not really related to our business. It's just kind of this, do-gooderism that we're, required to do, by your team or by management. And I think, that's one of the first things I like to address is to try to find common ground and show folks how that if you do it right, you can be more environmentally sustainable, more efficient, but also save money and run your organization more effectively. So that's usually, where we start, trying to break down that myth and, show people another way of looking at how to run their business.
So tell me then, you say you like to start off with that. Is that something that you bring up initially, or do you find it that folks are coming to you, like they come out the gate with objections, or how do you address these concerns?
So it really depends on how we get involved in a particular internal project. So, I would say there's sort of three ways historically I've gotten involved with folks in the organization. The first is that, someone reaches out with the question. It could be a new regulation or an idea they have. And I would say oftentimes we don't even really have to address the question at that point because it's either something they're already interested in or they know that they have to do, by law or regulation or something to that effect.
But I mean, there's a difference between having to do it and doing it well, right? I mean, it's, how do you motivate folks to get, I don't want to say excited per se, although if you can, that's great. But even taking it seriously beyond just what's the bare minimum I have to do to get you out of my office or off of this Zoom meeting?
Right, right. And I'll use actually a pretty recent example. I believe it's South Coast Air Quality Management District passed a new regulation in the distribution industry. So basically, recognizing that these facilities, which are pretty common in Southern California due to our proximity to the ports, there's a lot of truck traffic that go in and out of these buildings, right, which has an air quality impact. And so the warehouse managers and owners are required to report how many trucks they have coming in and out, and then based on the number of truck visits, take certain actions to basically offset the impact of the exhaust from the trucks. And they kind of give you a menu of options of things that you can do. And to your point, sort of at first blush, you would think if you're the facility manager or owner, you'd say, well, I just want to do the bare minimum, right? But one of the things that we do is we say, look, let's take a step back. Let's look at, the options you have and let's actually dig in and kind of understand the value streams associated with each of these because sometimes if maybe your bare minimum is you just want to make compliance, you just pay a fee or something of that nature, and then it becomes kind of like a tax basically. Or you could look at, hey, if this requires some level of investment, we now have an ROI, we can potentially reduce our operating costs and we can find a win-win. And so I would say that's a good recent example of where, like you said, it's, hey, if I just want to get this off my desk, that's certainly one approach. But if you're, owning the P&L, is that the best long-term value? Maybe not. And so that's, an example, one of the things that we explore with our internal stakeholders.
So let's talk about what are some of those ways that one can add value. Like in the let's continue with that example or another one if you'd prefer, but how does it add value in ways that may not be immediately or readily apparent?
Yeah. So I think what happens a lot in the area of environmental sustainability, as it's practiced in a corporate environment, is there's value streams in qualitative and quantitative that a lot of folks just aren't necessarily, used to looking for. So one of the examples that comes to mind in the course of my career is LED lights. So usually the pitch on LED lights is either you had legacy lighting products in your building and they're kind of at the end of their life cycle and you need to replace them. And back in the day, you used to be able to have options. Now it's kind of hard to find non-LED options. But then a project like that would be more driven by just kind of the looking at, hey, it's too expensive to keep fixing this old product. We need to put new product in. And at that point, we don't really care what the new product is. We'll just take whatever's on the market. But once we started looking more and more at LEDs, we started to realize not only do they use a lot less energy, which saves you money, both in your, working at Southern California Edison, so you appreciate the difference between the cost of the energy and the demand charges, which are charged by the utilities. So big savings on the demand side because they reduce the overall draw, but the light quality is a lot better. So people tend to be more productive in their workspaces. They feel more comfortable in public spaces like parking garages and outdoor spaces. they're also cooler. So even though it's probably impossible to measure accurately, you're not introducing as much heat into the indoor environment. So if you're in a hot environment like we are in Southern California, you don't have to run the air conditioning as much. So you kind of have these like other ancillary benefits that, most people don't think of right out of the gates. And so that's usually kind of the first conversation that we have on a particular project is say, all right, where are you as our internal stakeholder coming from in terms of your needs, wants, and sort of, thresholds? But then how do we look at this holistically to make sure that we're looking at all the various pros and cons? And I think, especially with this new technology, we're finding new pros and cons that folks haven't really considered, and it helps them make a better informed decision.
What about in terms of the business bottom line, right? Like I know there's these voluntary frameworks that folks sign on to that, obviously you have to meet the requirements of the framework, but do you find that that drives business? Or I get, maybe it's not necessarily your group per se that's seeing that, but do the appropriate groups see that driving business? Or have you had internal customers approach you with, hey, how do we get on board with this? Because my buyer wants us to have this certification or requirement. I don't know the right phrasing of it. I see these things, but I'm not terribly familiar with them. Tell us more about that. What does that mean for your internal customer, and having that conversation over the resistance that you'd normally get?
And that's where, kind of going back to what I said earlier it could be a regulation, could be a customer. I would say almost all the time it's a customer. You know, and this goes back, over the course of my career in environmental sustainability and into the AEG days, where nowadays, almost any RFP or tender or whatever you want to call it, depending on what part of the world you're in, there's going to be a section on sustainability, corporate responsibility, ESG, especially if you're dealing with governmental entity, and that goes beyond just environmental metrics. It gets into diversity of your supplier chain and things like that. And, those honestly are some of our best partners in the organizations is our go-to-market and sales teams, because they're hearing it from the customers, and the customers are demanding better, more responsible solutions. And, I don't care which company you work for, you want to make your customers happy and deliver what they want. And so, we're trying to not only do the right thing, but to position our company as, the most responsible, most forward-looking supplier for our customers. And that's been really gratifying because, you know, it's one thing if you can say, oh, I can save some energy. That's, reducing overhead. But if you can, increase sales and revenue, you'll make a lot of friends.
So, how do you deal with that when I imagine there are folks who come to you and say, hey, I want the increase in sales and revenue. I want the added value of the certification. But what's the cheapest, fastest, dirtiest way, pun intended, to get to this certification? They're not concerned with the details of it. They're more concerned with just checking a box so that they can put that into their RFP response or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's always going to happen, but I think it's similar to the discussion we had earlier, about the air quality compliance is, addressing all of the options, not just the check the box option. But that said, I definitely have found that, especially when you're dealing with really large sort of enterprise level customers, they have very large ESG, sustainability, corporate social responsibility departments. And they know, when you're the real thing, and they know when you're checking the box. And so, I think, because in our current organization, responsibility is one of our tenets of success. So, we're not going to fake it till we make it. We're doing it the right way. And I think folks understand that that's really in the long run, the best value play. So it doesn't really come up too much in that context, because like I said, the customers really know the difference. And in the long run, you're better off just being authentic and doing it the right way.
So let me ask though about, you mentioned that you don't get a lot of resistance to ESG from that kind of political element that's out there in the world today of anti ESG rhetoric. But do you get some, and when you see that, how do you address that? Because now that's somebody coming from their own personal place rather than necessarily the business place. So how do you adjust to how you address the concern in that instance?
Yeah. So honestly, I've in the workplace really almost never encounter it, to tell you the truth. I would say it's more of like a, Wall Street Journal or other media sort of debate. And to be totally honest, I think that debate is more sort of in the financial regulations section. And to be totally honest, I think it's a good discussion to have of if you're, say, for instance, marketing an ESG mutual fund, then you need to be pretty forthcoming about how you define ESG and what that means for your fund, right? Because I think that's relevant information an investor will want to have. And I think, what we've seen in the financial sector is, there's kind of all these different flavors of ESG, and now the regulators and, you know, other folks who are interested are saying, hang on, we got to define this and kind of come up with a standard ruler. So that's a bit of a side topic, but I think it's a good discussion to have. I would say, honestly, within the company walls, it's almost always two things. It's, I really don't have time for this because I got a lot of other things to do. And this is out of my area of expertise. And so I'm kind of out of my comfort zone and I need help. And so that's, really in the past two organizations, what I've tried to do is to say, we're an internal resource. We're here to help you with that.
Yeah, but that, the way you phrase that second one, you kind of tacked onto the end. This is something outside my comfort zone, and I need help. Do people say that? Is that right, or do you have to get them to that place?
No. And that's what's really refreshing, right? Is a lot of folks are like, look, I don't really know what LED lights are. I don't know what demand charges are, or I don't know where to put my coffee cup. Which of the 3 or 4 bins, depending on where you are, do I put it in? And yeah, people are usually really good about just putting up their hand and saying, I need help. Help me, walk me through this. Help me understand what I need to do.
Let's go back to the first thing that you mentioned, where you said, you get people who say, hey, look, I don't have time for this. I don't have resources for this. I am stretched thin. We're understaffed, overworked, so on and so forth. How do you address that resistance?
Well, first, I sympathize because I think we're all in that boat, right? In corporate America.
I think everybody feels they're in that boat, right? It's all a matter of degree, but yes.
Exactly. But that's where, in my current organization and past organization, we really try to position ourselves as a bit of an internal consultancy where, we can provide resources and expertise that, may not be available in that specific business group. And, we really try to just say, look, there's going to be parts of this, say, for instance, it's a new regulation that you're going to have to own. That's just going to be absorbed into your budget and resources. But, there's also a part of this that we can, help you with and kind of save you the effort. And so, there's so many examples, it's kind of hard to make a generalization. But, I think that's, what we're trying to find with these internal stakeholders is, to the extent that this, really is an additional burden, let's try to get there as efficiently as possible. And like I said in the beginning, look at all the options to find the best long-term value. Because, one of the things that I've seen, various places in my career is sometimes folks just want to check the box, take the easy way out, but they end up having to keep doing that, which itself is a big resource sink. So it's like sometimes if you just sort of have, pardon the pun, a more long-term sustainable solution, it's better for the long-term value play for your specific business group.
I will absolutely pardon the pun. I'm a big fan of dad jokes and puns. So by all means, pun away. And I think that's true a lot beyond even the kind of this corporate conversation. I see that, for example, when I'm dealing in mediations with folks who are having fights that are a different form of the same fight from years earlier. When you start hearing the history of, okay, and you sit down and say, tell me how we got here, right? And when I come into that conversation, often it's someplace where it's at the peak of animosity and that adversarial context because it's litigation, often things of that nature. But even when I get brought in pre-litigation, there's a lot of things build up because people don't want to do the hard work up front. And when you don't, that hard work up front, by avoiding it early on, you end up doing more work over time and having more cost and more bother frankly, whether that's in terms of cost, of resources, of just energy that gets drained, whether it's in the corporate context or in the personal context. So that's one thing that I have learned, I think, through this process for me is that addressing issues earlier on, right? That requires a little more work, but it pays substantial dividends down the road.
Couldn't agree more.
So let me ask then, just one final question. We've been talking a lot about in the work environment, but in the personal environment, when you are talking to folks, just through life or whatever at dinner parties, and you mention, oh, I do ESG work, do you get folks who want to start grilling you on it, who want to have it out, who think they're all of a sudden they're on the debate stage? And what is that like?
So, to be totally honest, not really.
Okay, well, that's positive.
I live in California, so that probably accounts for the lack of pushback. But, honestly, I think, people are coming around to this. They understand what's happening. They see the, increase in catastrophic weather events. They're seeing inflation, especially when, gas prices and things like that. They're excited about the new technology, vehicle electrification and, smart homes and things like that. So, yeah, I think, in my personal life, it's more of, what I would say is the garden variety, which bin do I put it in? Or I'm so used to, buying the plastic version and, I just need to kind of change my habits. But, I'm also very conscientious, I don't want to kind of come off as kind of Debbie Downer. So I try not to, bring the ESG or sustainability into too many conversations in my personal life. That said, though, people, friends and family know what I do. So a lot of times, if they have a question about solar panels or, you know, the new water law here in California or whatever, I'll get questions of that nature, and I try to be helpful.
Yeah, tell me if you would about what's kind of one common misconception out there about negotiation and about having these difficult conversations that you disagree with, and hopefully something that you passionately disagree with because it's something we can learn from.
So in my area, I would say the biggest misconception is that, you know, sustainability or ESG is, really just a financial drag on your company. And, it's just more compliance type work. I think there's a lot of value that can be added. And I think it's just about educating your internal stakeholders about how to look more holistically at the value streams and to not waste the effort of looking into something new, because that knowledge has value in and of itself. And we addressed this a little bit earlier when we were talking about, you know, checking the box versus, making sure you're taking the most value added approach to the specific project.
Right, right. Well, that's great. So John, one thing that we like to do here on the podcast, I like to ask folks a question and kind of about pop culture. So tell me, if you would, is there something from pop culture, right there, a scene in a movie or a story or some kind of a reference that now that you've gotten into, whether it's you've had a little bit of a varied career, which I think is great and interesting, but maybe it was in the field of litigation, maybe it was while working in the engineering world, maybe it's today and what you're seeing today. Is there something where you see that on TV or you hear, you read that story and you're just like, this isn't realistic, I'm not buying it, and why?
So I like this question, but I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to take it in a different direction.
Okay. Whose podcast is this, John?
Well, I think hopefully you'll appreciate this when we get finished.
I hope so too.
So I think there's obviously, plenty of artistic license, right? When you talk about like cop shows or lawyer shows or doctor shows. But as a, former litigation associate, one of my like favorite scenes of any movie was in this movie called Syriana with Matt Damon and I think George Clooney was in it too.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Jeffrey Wright is an attorney, and basically he's asking to review documents. And so he's in this big warehouse, and there's like box after box of documents. and the other side's counsel is like sitting there watching him like open box after box of documents. And I was like, wow, someone thought it was like important to show what a litigation associate's real work life looks like in a Matt Damon, George Clooney Hollywood movie. I was like, I did not expect that, but I was like, that was so accurate. I was very impressed. And then one step further, Legally Blonde, I found to actually be fairly accurate depiction of the law school experience. It's a comedy. There's, little things in there that obviously over the top, but I was like, kind of in the day in, day out of your first year of law school, I was like, I think they kind of nailed it.
So the thing I found about Legally Blonde was that she was working with, there were, several characters who were working effectively as what in reality would be senior associate or junior partner roles, folks that are, 7 to 10 years in to practice that they were doing during their first year of law school. And I don't know, obviously I didn't attend Harvard Law, so maybe it was different there, but nowhere that I ever practiced law were you going to be having 1Ls in doing any actual work. But I get it. Artistic license is required. Those are two good ones. I think, unfortunately, your document review example, though, dates us. The kids these days, they don't do document review in the same way. And I think that's missing something in a way, because while I did not enjoy the actual time sitting in the warehouse with the documents, when you used to have to travel to the warehouse, right? When there were so many documents, it became a week or multi-week trip, right? And that kind of camaraderie of the associates across, and some of the partners too, but across all the various parties represented, because obviously these would be large cases that they'd be bothering to spend the time and money on. And so I do have some fond memories of those times. Obviously, I'm blocking the pain of the actual time in the warehouse. So
Yeah, although, one of the things that I enjoyed about those days was, the law is the law. Like I don't want to say the easy part, but like it's all written down, and it's stare decisis. So you're kind of looking backwards to find out what's the guidance on this question. But all the interesting stuff is in the facts. And so, what I was not expecting is how interesting it would be to sort of read all the various documents and learn the facts of the case, because you know all kinds of really interesting information and good stories that come out of that you're like, wow, at least it's you know somewhat interesting reading, even if you're doing it for 60 80 hours a week for weeks at a time.
yeah, I had this one instance where in the document review, and again, this is long ago, back when the pre e-discovery really in any serious form, the emails would get printed out and then put into boxes stacked in that warehouse as well. And in one particular instance, the emails revealed that there was a particular executive who was having multiple romantic affairs and cutting and pasting the text of love emails to various colleagues, which was pretty entertaining for us, the folks who were stuck doing 60, 80 hours a week of document review, right? Trying to trace and these relations. It was completely a side matter of the case. It didn't really impact the case in any way, but there was one associate who took it upon himself to chart out the timeline of who was dating whom when, because, well, we were dork lawyers. I mean, this is what we took entertainment in.
Yeah, and it's context, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it does, and you're right. To that point, it does give you some context of what the kind of environment was in the company as to what was going on, what was, reasonable behavior or what was the behavior of this executive anyway. But yeah, nonetheless, I mean, those are the good parts. Those are the things that you remember, right? I had one case. I'll just get this last one. I'll let you go before we spend too long on Grandpa's story time hour here. But I remember this one case that was involving GE, and it involved a site where Jack Welch, as a young executive, had worked at, and there were photos in kind of the company newsletter of And at the time we're reading this, Jack Welch has published his book. He's a famous, business guru, all that kind of stuff. But this is him as a young executive, fresh out of MBA school, where he's at the company Christmas party at this plant out in, a small town USA. And so that was kind of a neat thing. Certainly not as interesting. Anyways, well, thank you for those stories. Those are two good ones, John. I appreciate it. Before we wrap up here, any final words, any final thoughts that you'd care to share here with our listeners about how to approach these difficult conversations?
Yeah, I think that's the first step, in my opinion, is to recognize that these are difficult conversations, right? And, I think that's kind of the first step, is to take the emotion off the table. That's one of the things that I appreciated in my years of being an attorney and, subsequent experience in real life is, oftentimes that's why, we use attorneys, right? Because these are, divisive, raw, emotional disputes. And you kind of need someone who's sort of a step removed to take that emotion out of it. But kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, where, maybe it's a customer requirement or a corporate new edict to, a site manager or a new regulation. Like, a lot of times I'll talk to the external stakeholder and we kind of start with just sort of the airing of the grievances, right? It's like, I just need to complain about this. And once we sort of get that energy out, okay, now let's like just sit down and like tackle the problem and try to do it as dispassionately as possible. Because, that's the thing. It's these disputes are just so, financially, intellectually, emotionally time consuming and resource consuming. It's like, why would you want to just keep it dragging on? Just, check your emotions, your baggage as much as you can, and just try to get down and fix it. And one other thing that I wanted to share was a little while ago, I remember reading an article about James Baker, who I believe was George Bush the First's Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, yeah.
And one of the things that the article is talking about him is that he was extremely well known for being a problem solver. He, obviously dealt with, huge issues, right? But won a lot of respect with everyone he worked with because he kind of tried to sit in each party's shoes and really understand their issues and their agendas. And okay, how can we fix this, right? It's just a problem to be solved. And that really resonated with me because I feel like it's exactly what you deal with in any kind of dispute. Is it's a problem to be solved, and if you kind of get to that space as quickly as possible, I think in the long run it's going to be less brain damage, less financial cost, and just a better outcome.
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap things up here. So, John, appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming on the podcast, and thank you so much. All right,
You're welcome.
Take care.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found our show valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for exclusive video content. We love hearing our listeners' thoughts and suggestions on guests or topics for future episodes, so please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or comment on Spotify, and we will catch you on the next one.